Thanks to the World Economic Forum for that video, and thanks to Ed for that opening address. The Commission and the World Economic Forum are co-authors of a white paper that's due to be published early next year, which will consider how Australia can lead in responsible innovation involving AI. Ed in that video provided a great introduction to the sorts of issues we want to discuss today, and now to deliver the opening keynote address, I ask you to welcome Australia's Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel AO.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you, Uncle Charles Chika, for your particularly warm welcome to this conference. I want to start off with a little story which commenced a few weeks ago when I took my mother and her best friend, whom I fondly call Auntie Rosa. Both of them, by the way, are in their 90s, and I took them out for a Saturday lunch. They love to hear about the state of the world, and they particularly like to hear from Australia's chief scientist. So what do? I decided to tell them about artificial intelligence. And first, I pulled out my iPhone and I demonstrated how I could use Siri to place a phone call. Then I explained that Siri was just a plaything compared to Google's new tool called Google Duplex. Duplex will place your call, perhaps to a restaurant, perhaps to a hairdressing salon. And then it will speak in a natural voice to the human being who answers the call, and it proceeds to make a booking. What sort of natural voice, my mother asked. Any voice, I said. You could stick with one of Google's, or maybe in the future you could give Google your own voice print, so the voice could sound just like yours. And then I told them about an email I'd received about a week earlier from a personal assistant of a friend of mine to set up a lunch, and the assistant's name was Amy Ingram. Initials, AI. Just think, I told my mum, right this minute, Amy, and by the way, she's got a brother robot named Andrew Ingram, Amy and Andrew are emailing and setting up meetings on behalf of tech-savvy people all over the world. Top executives, people in research labs, people in hospitals and schools, maybe even in government departments. Now, Amy and Andrew, they've got access to all those people's contact lists and their diaries and their emails. Whoa, Alan, slow down, I said to myself. I told them that there could actually be consequences if Amy and Andrew were hacked to reveal financial secrets and identities. Or even worse, what if we passed a law that required Amy and Andrew to spy on their employers and report anything deemed suspicious? It's amazing, I said to them, how much information that we are willing to give up in exchange for a little bit of convenience. Think, for example, about all the photos that your grandchildren are uploading to Instagram and Facebook. Now, all those photos can be used to train algorithms to recognise human faces. And in China, I told them, this technology has really taken off. Do you know that facial scanning, I said to them, in China is used from everything from dispensing toilet paper. They monitor to make sure that you can't come back too many times in a day, to picking out individual people in the crowd in the streets or at concerts. In some cities in China, and it's an expanding number of cities, everyone is assigned what is called a social credit score. And you gain or lose points depending on your behaviour, including any bad behaviour caught on camera and then picked up by the AI, such as littering or jaywalking. Now, if your social credit score gets too low, you just won't get a job, or you might not get a bank loan, or you might not get permission to travel and leave the country. And maybe, I said to them, We could use AI to go one step better, not just to punish the offenders, but to preempt their crimes, as we just heard about. Police and security agencies in some countries, and Australia as well, are already using AI to pinpoint the people who are most likely to make trouble so that they can place them under closer surveillance. And welfare agencies are using algorithms to work out which children ought to be separated from their parents. And as I talked, Auntie Rosa grew tense. Tears welled in her eyes. Now, I don't like to make my mother's friends cry, so I asked her, "What's the matter?" But of course, I should have known Auntie Rosa was a Holocaust survivor. For 4 years, she lived in hiding in Lithuania, a young Jewish woman persecuted for the crime of being alive. And as I drew my little pictures of the future, she saw only the brutal truth of the past. A life lived in fear of being watched by neighbours, by shopkeepers, by bogus friends. And to this day, her fear was so overwhelming that she would not consent to let me use her real name in sharing something of her story with you today. She didn't know at the time, and I'm not sure that she does know or would want to know now, but it was data that made a crime on the scale of the Holocaust possible. Every conceivable data set was turned to the services of the Nazis and their cronies. Census records, medical records, to the eternal shame of scientists, even the data from scientific studies. Now, with a lot of data, you need a sorting technology. And the Nazis, they had access to one. Not computers, but their predecessors, tabulating machines using punch cards. Little pieces of stiff paper with perforations in the rows and the columns, marking individual characteristics like gender, age, and religion. And that same punch card technology that so neatly sorted humans into categories was also used to schedule the trains to the death camps. So Auntie Rosa suffered from data plus technology in the hands of ruthless oppressors. But she survived the war and she came to Australia. And here, she found a society where people trusted in their government and they trusted in each other. She saw the same technologies that had wrought such terrible crimes in Eastern Europe. She saw them used here for the collective good. Yes, data in a humane society could be used to help people, help them to plan cities and run hospitals and to enrol every child in school. You could get a driver's license without fear. You could carry a Medicare card and feel grateful. You could live quietly in your own house, free from surveillance and feeling safe. People weren't perfect, but for the most part, they lived peacefully together in a society governed by manners and laws, using technology to make life better. And in that kind of society, surely artificial intelligence could be put to the service of human beings, to serve the needs of human rights. I think of the right to ease of travel. And in that light, what might self-driving cars mean for the elderly or people living with a disability? I think of the right to freedom from slavery or forced labour. And in that light, Border security agencies are using AI to find the victims of human trafficking. They can collect the images of women reported missing and compare them to the faces of women crossing national borders or appearing in any of the millions of advertisements online. I think of the right to found a family. And in that light, researchers based right here in Sydney are using AI to improve the outcomes of IVF. In the standard procedure, embryos are assessed by the doctors to choose which ones to implant to maximise the likelihood of a successful pregnancy. Now, AI can make that choice far more swiftly and reliably. So we can spare families at least some of the trauma and expense of IVF cycles that fail. Now, a caring society could not possibly turn its back on that kind of potential. And I know that my mother and Auntie Rosa would surely agree. And as I told them about the power of AI, they wanted only to know that a future Australia would still be the place that they had grown to cherish, where one could be happy and safe and free. How, Auntie Rosa asked me, how would you protect me, my daughter and my granddaughter from living in a world in which we are constantly monitored? How, dear Alan, would you protect our liberty? Now, Auntie Rosa's question to me is, in my words, my challenge to you. What kind of society do we want to be? I look around the world, and it seems to me that every country is pursuing AI its own way. It's true, there are some questions that we can only resolve at the level of global agreements, like the use of AI in weapons of war. But the way that we integrate AI into our societies will be determined by the choices that we make at home. Governments decide how companies are allowed to use data. Governments decide how to invest public funds in AI development. Governments decide how they want to harness AI for policing and healthcare, and education and social security, systems that touch us all. And that means that nations like Australia, we have choices. We are capable technology innovators, but we've always imported more technology than we develop at home. That's inevitable given our size. However, it does not mean that we have to accept a future that we're handed by companies in China or Europe or the United States. To the contrary, we can define our own futures by being leaders in the field of ethics and human rights. And that is my aspiration for Australia, to be human custodians. In my mind, that means showing the world how an open society, a liberal democracy, and a fair-minded people can build artificial intelligence into a better way of being, a better way of living. Am I asking too much? Perhaps. But let's not forget, we've been pioneers of progress with ethics before. And I've been reflecting this week on IVF. Tomorrow, the world's first IVF baby, Louise Brown, will celebrate her 40th birthday. And it's fascinating now to look back at all the things that were written and said when she arrived. People thought that it was unnatural, that the babies would be deformed or somehow less than fully human, or that we would start making humans in batch lots, in factories. But here in Australia, we listened to the patients and the clinicians who saw the real promise of this technology. No one out there could hand us a ready-made rule book because there wasn't one. So we had to create one, and we did. Australia was the first country to collate and report on birth outcomes through IVF. We built a regulatory model that kept our clinics at the leading edge of the science while keeping their patients safe. We published the first national ethical guidelines on IVF anywhere in the world. We harnessed the Medicare system to help families to meet the costs. And clinics worked closely together so that success rates improved steadily right across the country. And so, ultimately, IVF became a mainstream procedure, getting better over time. And I would put it to you that there are lessons here for the approach that we take to AI. The first and most important, don't expect a single answer or a one-shot, set and forget AI law. That wasn't the secret to adopting IVF. No, we had a spectrum of approaches that worked together and evolved in line with the state of the technology and the levels of comfort in the community. There were laws and regulations, there were industry codes and practices, and there were social norms. And we will need to develop a similar spectrum of responses to AI so that we can strike the balance between opportunity and risk. And I've been thinking in particular about the low risk end of the spectrum. And by this, I mean products like smartphone apps and digital home assistants that promise to make your life a bit easier. What if we had a recognised mark for ethical technology vendors, like the Fair Trade stamp for ethical suppliers? In my mind, I would call it the Turing certificate after the famous scientist, the father perhaps of AI, Alan Turing. The standards will be developed by a designated expert body in close consultation with consumer groups and industry. Then companies that wanted to display the mark would submit both the specific product and their company processes for an ethics audit by an independent auditor, so that you, as a consumer, could put your purchasing power behind those ethical developers, and the developers would know what they need to do to make the ethical products that people want. This could be an idea that Australia could help to pilot and spread. But I emphasise this voluntary system would be suitable only for low-risk consumer technologies. So what about those technologies that touch more directly on our freedom and our safety? Where else could Australia be influential? And I point to the public sector. We have a cohort of leaders right across government squaring up to their responsibilities as AI adopters and human custodians. Just last week, the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs, the Super Department, named Michael Pizzulo, he went on the record with his agency's approach to AI. And he went further. He proposed a line in the sand, not just for border security, but for every decision made in government, every decision that touches on a person's fundamental rights. And he called it the Golden Rule. And I'm going to quote. He said that no robot or artificial intelligence system should ever take away someone's right, privilege or entitlement in a way that cannot ultimately be linked back to an accountable human decision maker. And to me, this golden rule is a partial answer to my question. It is the mark of a public sector fit to be an ethical custodian. And I know from my conversations with leaders in many agencies that they are looking to the Australian Human Rights Commission to help them to interpret that custodianship. Today, we are launching a 3-year process to consider these issues, to identify the manners, the ethics, the human rights, the protections that will work for all of us, not just the early adopters. And I applaud the initiative of Human Rights Commissioner Ed Santow and his colleagues. We must all be involved in this national discussion. And every time we come to a decision point about the technologies that we are going to allow into our lives, we must ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to be? To start, let's be a society that never forgets to ask that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. What a fantastic start to the day. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second opening keynote speaker. She is architect of ethical AI practice at Salesforce and is one of the world's foremost experts on artificial intelligence and the integration of ethics into AI. So to continue the discussion, joining us from the US, please welcome Kathy Baxter.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. There we go. I am so blessed to have my daughter in the audience today. Touches my heart. She is a daily reminder to me of how important the issue of technology's impact on human rights is. I see her zombied out on a mobile phone and I worry about her becoming addicted. Or I see yet another story of bias in AI, particularly perpetrating stereotypes about women. And I worry about AI limiting her choices and her options. I wanted to begin with a quick look at history to see where we've come from before we start talking about where we're going. At the beginning of the 1800s, the textile industry employed the vast majority of people in the north of the UK. It was a pretty good life. People could work from home, they rarely worked more than 3 days a week, and they were paid a fair wage. But following the Napoleonic Wars, the economy really took a hit. And when fashions changed, the merchant class that employed all of the textile workers needed to reduce their costs. They began by reducing wages, but they also brought in technology to improve their efficiency. These larger, more expensive machines had to be housed in a factory, so now people can no longer work from home. They worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week under brutal conditions. As the merchant class began to increase their profits, they weren't sharing them with the workers. So the workers banded together and they tried to negotiate a fairer salary. But the merchant class would hear nothing of it. So the workers, under the self-name of Luddites, came together and they destroyed the machines that were allowing the merchants to take advantage of them. The Luddites were not against technology. They used smaller versions of these machines in their homes. What they objected to was the disadvantage that was being taken of them. So the story of Luddites that you often hear is of technology and automation taking away jobs. We know that more jobs were eventually created than what were taken away. Unfortunately, those that were automated out of the jobs were rarely qualified for those new jobs. And so the story, more broadly, of the Luddites is about those in power using technology to give an advantage to a privileged few while disenfranchising the many. That was the first industrial revolution. Today we're told we're embarking on the fourth industrial revolution, where robotics, AI, and the Internet of Things is changing the world as we know it. According to McKinsey Global Institute, between 400 million and 800 million people are going to have their jobs automated by 2030. Again, we predict that more jobs will be created than are lost. But again, those who are having their jobs automated are unlikely to be qualified for those new jobs. According to the Pew Research Center, the US is seeing levels of inequality not seen since 1928, the Great Depression. Technology's influence is growing from physical and local, like factories and electric street lamps, to today, it is invisible, global, and omnipresent, from facial recognition technology to China's social credit score. Now, I'm no Luddite wishing to smash the machines of our oppressors. I've worked at big tech companies for the last 2 decades, and I will be the first to talk about all of the amazing advances that AI in particular is allowing us to have, from being able to identify tumors that humans miss, to AI preserving indigenous languages that are being lost, like right here in Australia. But we have to act to ensure that technology gives back more than it takes, that technology is benefiting our society and not just empowering a few while disenfranchising the many. And it is up to the technology and AI creators to see that that happens. Government should be in place to put checks and balances in place. But the creators have the first responsibility. Technology is all about choices. We have to make choices. As citizens, as consumers, what do we buy? Who do we give our time and our mind share to? As employees, who are we willing to work for? And as governments, what are we willing to do? What are we willing to put into place to keep those businesses in check when they decide they don't want to play fairly? The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. That sucks. I couldn't agree more. This quote by Jeffrey, he was one of the early Facebook employees. He built the infrastructure that Facebook uses to collect user data, manage it, and analyze it. And as you can see, he became disillusioned. Research shows that very specific design choices can be made that lead to addiction. We see this in our children and ourselves as we spend hours staring at our little phones. How many of you, if your phone buzzed in your pocket right now, would feel compelled to take a glance, take a quick peek? What does it mean? What was that? What's that notification? We all do it. We can't help it because that's what it's been designed for. Deloitte conducted a mobile consumer survey last year here in Australia, and they found that 35% of Australians check their mobile device within 5 minutes of waking up. 70% of Australians admit to using their phone during dinner time with friends and family. I'm surprised it's actually that low. So we know designers are using knowledge of behavioral training and human cognitive weaknesses to create experiences that are sticky in Silicon Valley terms. They're creating addiction. As Stephen Hawking once said, AI is likely to either be the best or worst thing to happen to humanity. There is no technology today that dominates the headlines more than AI. And if you follow those headlines, you will see that AI is sexist, racist, and full of systematic biases. But why? Why is this happening? As I've spent so much time doing research into these areas, I've read the stories behind the headlines and found that over and over again, the people who are creating these tools aren't doing it with evil in mind. They don't want to perpetrate the bias. They're actually trying to resolve it. They're trying to fix it. But the problem is, bias is so difficult to see in the data. Equally complex is the question of what it means to be fair. So let's have an example. Let's talk about a bank using an AI to determine whether or not an applicant should be approved for a loan. Now, AI is based on probability and statistics. There is no way an AI can be perfect. It can never predict the future perfectly. So there's going to be some error. So the AI may recommend rejecting an applicant, even though they are actually able to repay the loan. Or it may recommend to approve an applicant when they actually can't repay that loan. And so as an AI administrator, you would be responsible for deciding which type of error do you want to optimize for. Now, most businesses are going to optimize to minimize the risk to their business and to their stakeholders. But they are responsible for ensuring that the AI is making its decisions based on an applicant's merits, their ability to repay that loan, and not based on systematic bias that they have no control over. If an AI is using any of these factors, race, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, it is going to disenfranchise a segment of the population unfairly. And even if you are not explicitly using these factors in the algorithm, there are proxies for them that you may not even be aware of. In the US, zip code plus income equals race. If you have those two factors in your algorithm, your algorithm may be making recommendations based on race. We need to have a more enlightened view about the role of companies. This company, meaning Salesforce, is not somehow separate from everything else. Are we not all connected? Are we not all one? Isn't that the point? I love this quote by Mark Benioff. I know I've drank the Kool-Aid. Mark is co-founder and CEO of Salesforce. And at Salesforce, we strongly believe that companies have a responsibility, not just to our shareholders, but all stakeholders. And that means society. We must be responsible. And luckily, we have a framework for this. We don't have to start from scratch. In 2011, the UN approved the Framework and Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But what we have to do is ensure that businesses are adhering to them and that governments are enforcing it. Due to public pressure, many companies are now creating solutions to help deal with the negative effects of the technology that they have created. Recent examples are Google and Apple announcing screen time apps that enable users to monitor, understand, and limit, if they so choose, the amount of screen time that they are showing. I'm not here to argue that businesses should forfeit profit in the name of society and social justice. I am here to say that we can do well and do good. Businesses do better when society flourishes than when inequality flourishes. And so I wanted to end with 5 recommendations for how industry can do well and do good. The first is by creating an ethical culture. Companies need to understand their values, and they need to educate and empower employees to live those values. They need to create incentive structures that empower and reward the employees that live those values every day. These are Salesforce's values of trust, customer success, innovation, and equality. We live these in everything we do each day. Second, create a diverse culture. There was a fantastic article in Scientific American in 2014 that summarized decades of research showing that diverse teams are more creative, diligent, and harder working. When teams are not diverse, we see feature gaps. We see products that are created in an echo chamber for the very people that created them and not for the people that may be most impacted by them. In addition to creating diverse teams, and I don't just mean age, gender, race, I'm also talking about experience, backgrounds, work styles. We also need to give employees the space to question each other and the status quo. Third, we must empower users. We need to understand deeply who our customers and users are, what their needs and values are. That sounds obvious, but I cannot tell you how many companies truly do not understand who their users are. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation gives guidelines for empowering users, allowing users to see their data, download it, and request to delete it. This is an example from Salesforce Pardot where admins can go in and delete data if a user so requests. Remove exclusion. You have to deeply understand the data that's in your system in order to identify the bias and remove it. In this particular example of Einstein lead scoring, we see that having the first name of John makes you an excellent sales lead. Now, it seems ridiculous that what your mama named you would have any influence on how good or bad a sales lead you are, but the AI doesn't see it that way. The issue is that in the training data, we have a whole lot of Johns. It's not surprising, in the US, John is the most common male name, but this is not a very useful factor, and so we point that out to the user and help them better understand it. We use Trailhead, Salesforce's educational platform, to educate employees as well as our users to help them build ethics into their systems. Finally, industry must partner with government. Many businesses believe that regulation will stifle innovation, and that's not true. At the Applied AI conference in San Francisco this past April, I heard multiple stories of businesses that partnered with regulations. One biotech firm in particular partnered with the US FDA, and both learned more together than they could have independently. And in the end, the biotech company was able to assure its customers that its new product met with the FDA guidelines. So I wanted to leave you with this final quote by Dr. Vivian Mean. Technology must always challenge us. When we turn it off, we should be better than when we turned it on. Thank you.